G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. Today's tutorial is going to be on authentication within Firebase. And this is the first thing you're going to want to do to use the Firebase database. You need to authenticate your users. Firebase has a number of supported third-party sign-ons including Google, Facebook, Twitter and GitHub. And in addition, you can also use email password or anonymous and phone authentication. Regardless of which system you use, there is a basic underlying methodology and implementation that you should follow that will allow your app to function regardless of which authentication system you implement. In addition, you can also implement multiple methods so that your clients will be able to sign on with the various providers such as Google or Facebook, and if they have neither of those, you can always supply an email and password or even anonymous until such time as they want to fully subscribe. Now, talking of subscriptions, it's a great time to subscribe to the Swift Almanac channel. That's free, and also to download a copy of our Swift Almanac members app so that you can stay updated, get access to the source code, and get access to members only content. Anyway, let's have a look at Firebase authentication. Okay, so here we are doing Firebase authentication. What I'm going to show you is how to authenticate in both using the Google sign-in feature and also using the anonymous login feature. And I'm also going to show you how you can link or change the credentials from one credential to another. Now we'll just have a quick look at what is needed. So in our pod file, we need Firebase Core, Firebase Auth, and I've included Firebase Database, which we don't actually need for this tutorial, but it forms part of our data structure that we're going to need. So we have included it, and we're going to use it Google Sign-In, so we need to get this Google Sign-In pod as well. So once you've got those installed in your pod file, you can just type pod install and that will all happen. Now it's January 2018, we're running, I don't know what version, whatever the latest version is. Let's have a look. Pod install 4.8.1, so it's all the latest versions and the like. Now I have set up my Xcode the way I would normally set up like a default project. So I've copied down my Google Service Info plist, which we covered in setup in the last tutorial. One thing you will need to do is this reverse client ID. You need to copy that and go to info and then down to URL types. And then you click on the plus sign to get a URL type and then paste that into this URL scheme. That's going to be required for this Google sign-in button. So once you've done that, that's a good thing to start with. The other thing, if you're not familiar with what I've done in previous things, this defaults.zib just gets rid of a little error, which may not even be an error anymore because it's a different version of the compiler. Basically, this is all done in code, no storyboard, so we don't have a main storyboard, and our launch screen file is just this default.zib. So we don't need to worry about anything exciting there. Then we've got 4 view controllers, of which we're only using 3. We have a splash view controller, which is just blue. That just lets us know that our application is up and running. And then we have the login view controller, which is red because we need to log in, and it contains a Google sign-in button and an anonymous login button. And then our main view controller, once we've actually logged in, just click on anonymous login now. So we will log in. There you go, it's green and it's got a log out button, and it's also got this sign in button from Google. You might be asking yourself why. Well, this green sign in button in fact is I've taken a shortcut. I'm just using the Google button, so I don't need to customize it. But it is really just linking the anonymous account which we have set up with the Google account. Anyway, I'll log back out. Takes us back to the red screen. And then in terms of my other general situation is I've got this global functions for moving to a splash screen, moving to a login screen, moving to the main screen, and moving to the settings window, which we can call anywhere if we need to. And that's pretty much it for the generics. Let's look at our App Delegate and see what it does. So we have our standard 3 lines where we open our Splash view controller at the beginning, and when we are using Firebase, we have to call Firebase app.configure, and then what we need to do is we add this user listener, which is in our Firebase database model, and what we are doing is we are listening to the Firebase database to see whether or not we are logged in or not, and as you can see, it says check for a current login token, and some of the authentication methods provide tokens, and so this has a different outcome based on whether or not there's a token or not, but we're not using tokens, so you don't need to worry about that right now. And then because we're using the Google sign-in button, there's an app delegate which is in this extensions class over here, but we need to initialize it and set the delegate to ourselves, and we need to set the client ID equal to our Firebase app client ID to link Google and Firebase. So 2 separate products, 1 owner. So just because you're logged into Google doesn't necessarily mean that you're also logged into Firebase, which we need to keep aware of. Now, when we click on this Google sign-in button, the first time you do it, it's going to do your typical OAuth 2 situation where it takes you over to a Gmail account and asks you to sign in, and then it comes back, and so you need to have this God sign-in shared instance handle URL, just copy and paste that text and place it in there so that the delegate works. And then we'll look at our app delegate and we'll see that there is basically 2 methods that we need to implement. One is the did sign in for, so i.e. we've logged into Gmail or our Google account, and the other one is did disconnect with, which is log out. You can see Logout's actually doing nothing for us currently, but the protocol requires us to have both. So let's look at our Firebase database and see what it is that we're doing. Now, we've set this up as a singleton, and your typical shared static property. Now, there is a Firebase property called user, which may or may not be set, because if we're logged out, that is nil. And for convenience, we assign it to a variable as part of our MyFirebase class. And one of the properties of this user field is a user ID or a UID, and we're going to set that to be a string that is currently empty. However, every time the user value is valid, i.e. not nil, then it'll have a property called UID, which will also be a non-nil string. And if we look at our console, you can see here for every user, even if we don't know who they are because they didn't have a Facebook email address, they have a user ID. And then finally we have this DB reference, and this is what I said before, we've included Firebase Database, even though we aren't reading and writing data to the database files at the moment. We create this database reference, and that just gives us a shorthand way of saying all of that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create this auth state did change listener handle, and it's actually a pretty important function because it does a lot more than if we are authenticating and listening. It actually handles the start display of our windows. So if the user is 0, then, or nil I should say, then we're logged out. We set the current user to be nil, and we set the user ID to be empty, and then we wait for 3 seconds, and here's this logged in parameter I was talking about before. If we are logged in, we move to the main screen. You're wondering how that could possibly be the case. And secondly, we move to the login window. So in some instances, Google does not support the API that we want to authenticate with. For instance, the Uber API. And so what we can do is we can do the OAuth stuff ourselves with the Uber API, and that would allow us to log in, but we might not necessarily be logged in with Firebase because they're two separate authentications. But then if our user is a valid user, then we want to log in. We set our user and our user ID, and we're going to print that user ID out so you can see it in the console. And then once we've logged in, we wait 3 seconds, and then we move to the main window. And of course we need to do this on the main queue because this is user interface stuff, and this is a callback, and it could be happening in a background thread. And the other thing we need to do is, seeing as we have added a user listener, is we need to also remove a user listener so that if our app closes down, we tell Firebase that we don't need to be listening for this anymore. And if we go back to our app delegate, you can see that one of the first things we do is we add the user listener, and not surprisingly, on application will terminate, we are going to remove the user listener. So these are things we do once each. And when we're listening, then we are all pretty happy. So the things we need to do is we need to be able to sign in anonymously. We need to know if we are logged in, and we also have this function for linking credentials, and we have this logout function. So this is basically what we're doing. It would have been really nice if this delegate didn't have to be here, but we've got login for Google in a different file to Firebase, but there's not much we can do. In fact, there's nothing we can do about that. So let's see what happens on our login screen. So in our login screen, we've got this Google button, and we've also got this anonymous login button, red screen. We've got we don't actually need that line there, but anyway. We've got this target, which is sign in anonymously. If we click on the anonymous login, and it just calls our Firebase shared sign in anonymous, which is just this auth.auth sign in anonymously, passes us a user, returns an error, and we just print out the information. Now, we don't do anything if the user is authenticated correctly, because we've installed our user listener, and our user listener is going to say, hey, we've got some authorization for this user, and it's going to say, that it's been successful, and here's our user, and here's where we're updating the current details, and here's where we're moving to the main window. So the beauty of having a listener is the listener doesn't care what the authentication method is. So you can have like every authentication method listed on your login page, and your client can choose whichever one they want, and whichever one they choose, this user listener is going to come back and say they're logged in or they're not logged in. You don't care which one, you just need to know that they've been authenticated. So here we have the sign in user listener, and we have auth.auth sign in anonymously. And if we look at our Google sign in, then we have a similar sort of thing. There's no actual call because it's handled by the button default automatically, because this is supplied by the framework. But when we have signed in and we get the error message back, then we get the here it is, auth.sign in with a credential. But anyway, I shall get back to that. So if we click on an anonymous login, what happens is we have never used the system before, and this anonymous login sends us a user ID, PQ9MA, and if we look at our console and update it again, there it is, PQ9MA. As you can see, it's anonymous. Now, this is valid. I'm not quite sure for how long, but it's certainly valid for a day or two. If we just not log out but close the application and run it again, then we're still logged in, and when we run the app again, we'll add the listener. The listener will say, hey, we're already logged in, and we've come to the green logged in screen, and you can see that our user ID is PQ9MA. So we're still going to be using this same user ID, and we're still going to be able to access all of the data that user PQ9MAW, etc. is able to access, which is what we want. However, if we log out, there you go, we've logged out. Well, now we've essentially lost that data because when we anonymously log in again, we're allocated a new user ID, and when you've got anonymous login, you can't just save this user ID and say, hey, I want to log back in as this user. If you want to do that, you need to use one of the proper authentication tools like username and password, or Facebook, or the Google one. So now that we're logged in as DEHVT, just have a quick look at them. Where are we? So many anonymous people here. DEHVT, was that the one? DEHVT, that was the one. Okay, now we're on our green screen, so we're already logged in. So we want to now go, hey, stick me on Google, and I've already logged in, so it's not going to ask me for all my credentials. But you can see here it's come through and it's gone, oh, credential linked. So now, rather than anonymously logging in, we go back to our users. Here I am as a Google login, DEHV. So now when I want to access this data, every time I log out, so I can log out, and now when I log back in again, my Google ID is all cool, and it says I'm logged in and I'm getting access to the data for the DEHVT, etc. So that's the scope and limitations of the login service. how we do it is interesting. If we look at our App Delegate Google sign-in, this is where the exciting stuff happens. If we click on the button, what we need to determine is whether or not we're currently logged in anonymously or whether or not we already are a Google sign-in. So what we do is we look at our current user value, and if this current user is non-existent, then what we want to do is we want to sign in with a credential that we already have, and if not, then we want to check to see if the user is an anonymous user. So Firebase actually keeps a record of whether or not we're an anonymous login or not, and if we're an anonymous login, then rather than this guard statement is going to fail, so we're not going to go in through here. What we're going to do is we're going to link the credentials so that we can access the anonymous logged in account or user. Okay, so in the last thing I want to show is like in the logout function. So you've got to understand you're logging into two different things. You're logging into Firebase, and this auth.signout, that's logging you out of Firebase, but you're still logged in to Gmail or Google or whatever you want to look at it. So if you want to actually when someone logs out, if you want to log them out of Gmail and make them authenticate again, like next time they open the application, which is probably what someone's expecting when they log out, then you need to add this god signin.sharedinstance.signout call. So we're in green, so we're logged in, even though it says sign in. So we're in green. If we're to close the app, well, we're still logged in. And if we run it again, we've got green and it just goes straight there, nothing to ask. But if we log out, now we're logging out of Firebase and we're logging out of Google. And even if we click sign in now, it's going to start asking us all the typical OAuth questions. So it just sort of depends on what you want to do in terms of signing out. Are you signing out of both Google and the app, probably preferred, or are you just signing out of Firebase? Anyway, that's authentication, anonymous authentication, and the Google authentication. And essentially, there's really no difference. Every one of these sign-in methods is going to be able to provide you with a credential that you can pass to this link credential. So if you don't want to use Google but you want to use Facebook, essentially you're just still going to have in this sign-in area, when you, instead of using Google Auth Provider, you're going to use Facebook Auth Provider. .credentials, you're going to pass these authentication tokens, you're going to get a credential, and then that credential's still going to be passed here, and it's going to allow you to link the anonymous account to a Facebook account or to a user ID and password or to a phone or whichever other sign-in method that you want. So hopefully that is all clear. So that's the basics of Firebase authentication. Once clients can authenticate themselves, we can have a look at giving them access to reading and writing the data in the Firebase database. So if you're interested in obtaining a copy of the source, download the Swift Almanac Members app and become a member. It costs you $2 a month, and then you'll have complete access to all the source code on the channel. If you like the tutorial, then hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That's free. See you next time. Cheers.